Thank you.
Starting YouTube.
Yes, sir.
You're on everywhere.
Good morning. I'm Sherman Stanford, and this is Making Sense of the Chaos. We've been talking about God, His creation, the fall, man before the fall, man after the fall, and most recently we're discussing man's ontological explanation for life. The mechanism that he, fallen natural man, uses, scientific naturalism, uses for explaining life and its proliferation, its development, its origin, is what's called evolutionism. We talked about that yesterday. There are a few basic principles that I think we need to keep in mind, and so let me go over those for you right now. First, God created the cosmos for His glory, not for man's. Second, the jewel of creation is man. Third, although in no sense the author of evil, God ordained Adam's fall. Fourth, in Adam the entire creation fell, including all of mankind. 5, as a result of the fall, God pronounced the curse of enmity between the seed of the woman, all those who will spend eternity with God, and the seed of the serpent, the remainder of humanity. This is known as the great antithesis. 6th, all subsequent human experience is an outworking of this enmity. Every time that you have any contact with any human being, it's always in terms of the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman. Either you're dealing with a fellow member of whichever seed you belong to, or you're dealing with somebody who belongs to the opposite seed. But in any event, everything that you say, do, and think between yourself and other human beings is involved in that enmity. And 7th, the unregenerate are without excuse. They know God, but they suppress the truth about God in culpable self-deceit. Okay, now, let's talk about some of the fundamental errors that evolutionism makes. The first place to look for error is in the assumption that evolution builds from the simple to the increasingly complex. Biologists know there's no such thing as a simple life form. The simple protozoan is actually a full-blown, highly complex organism. Philip Johnson, at page 77 of his book Defeating Darwinism, says, quote, "You need to understand that molecular organisms are irreducibly complex. What this means is simply that they are made up of many parts that interact in complex ways, and all the parts need to work together. Any single part has no useful function unless all the other parts are also present. There is therefore no pathway of functional intermediate stages by which a Darwinian process could build such a system step by tiny step. Treating as legitimate a theory which relies on such a dubious foundation as this is sloppy science at best. At worst, it is deliberate deception and therefore dishonest. For the most part, however, it is an example of the outworking of the self-deception Paul refers to regarding unbelievers and their relationship with God in Romans 1. While it is certainly true that the theory of evolution assumes increasing complexity, it is also true that the simple life forms it requires have not been demonstrated to exist. All life forms are incredibly complex, self-contained biological factories bearing mute but eloquent witness to the impossibility of their occurrence by chance. Remember, chance is randomness. To assume that something as complex as even a single-celled organism could have occurred by chance just absolutely staggers the imagination. It's absurdly preposterous. The next error we address is subtler. Evolutionists point to the undeniable fact that adaptive changes occur. They can be observed and recorded, and they occur both widely and repetitively. For instance, in order for a poodle to exist, breeders have to take dogs who have certain characteristics and they breed them together with other dogs bearing those same characteristics, and they fine down the breed to where finally they have a poodle. and that's adaptive changes that are planned and executed by breeders intentionally and with malice aforethought. But this they define as evolution because there are changes. Ergo, evolution has been proved, they assert. Any refusal at that point to accept evolution after the proof has been adduced is termed by the scientists as obscurantism, that is, deliberate refusal to admit clear evidence and the logical conclusions that flow from it, obstinately flying in the face of proven facts. In this argument, what goes unnoticed is that the creationist objection to evolution is not a denial of microevolution. I'm willing to grant them that there are adaptive changes, and if you want to call that evolution, then let's call that microevolution. But proving there are adaptive changes is a long step from proving that these adaptive changes can account for changes from one species to another, or one kind to another, or even that they prove the original creation of life itself. The creationist, me, does not deny small incremental changes within, but limited to broad categories of living organisms. Rather, he denies there is evidence that such small incremental changes produce entirely new life forms. That would be macroevolution. In effect, a bait and switch has occurred. This is the logical fallacy known as equivocation. It occurs when the same term is used in different senses within the same argument without acknowledging the change in meaning. A slightly humorous but classic expression of equivocation is the logical syllogism, some dogs are brown, my dog is brown, my dog is some dog. Although this is a humorous example, nevertheless, it's telling. Some, in this case, is used in different senses in the initial premise and the conclusion without acknowledging the change in meaning. Obviously, the some dogs in the beginning refers to quantity, and in the conclusion refers to quality. These are entirely different categories, but covered by the same word. And so if you use the same word but with different meanings at different points in your argument, you haven't proved anything. What you've done is, it's at best just simply illogical. At worst, it's deceptive, a lie. Evolutionists prove microevolution, adaptive changes within a relatively narrow range, then claim that proof as a general proof of evolution, leaving unaddressed the larger question of proving macroevolution, the idea that entirely new life forms are produced evolutionarily, in hopes perhaps that no one will notice the inconvenient fact. Since microevolution and macroevolution are quite distinct concepts, although in theory perhaps arguably related, the effect of equivocation is to avoid dealing with the very question in controversy. It is at best disingenuous self-deception and is both bad philosophy and bad science. At worst, it is rank dishonesty. Another proof offered by evolutionists is to point to animal breeders, we talked about that, and the success they have achieved in producing new strains of previously existing breeds. Now, unfortunately, when they point to the animal breeders, they introduce some problems that they would rather not have. This is a weaker effort than the previous era. As a proof, it is confused on more than one level. First, it repeats the failure to distinguish between adaptive changes within relatively narrow categories, microevolution, and the production of new life forms, macroevolution. No animal breeder has ever produced an entirely new kind of animal. Even more dismal for scientific naturalists, it offers far more proof for intelligent design than for random, undirected change. Only by rigorous control of breeding can these exotic strains be produced. They cannot be accounted for by blind chance, nor do they occur in nature apart from the specific guidance of human agents. Think about it. If what they're trying to prove is that randomness can account for huge changes within forms of life, pointing to directed, planned, intelligently executed changes hardly makes their case. It seems much more proof the other way, that the only way to produce these kinds of even small changes is by intentionally directing them. What's worse, the records of these new breeds have tended to show less, not more, general fitness for survival. In many cases, they notoriously lack hardihood. Exotic canine breeds such as poodles, for example, they're highly neurotic. They have significant health issues, structural issues. Many of these small breeds have degenerative arthritis and other conditions, because you see when you're inbreeding, and you have to inbreed in order to produce these breeds. The whole way you do it is you isolate certain factors. Well, you're isolating factors that you desire, but you're also isolating factors that you don't desire. And so what occurs is that you breed out the general hardihood, the survivability of the breed. Even worse, the history of animal breeding demonstrates beyond dispute that there are marked limits to changes that may be induced. God, through nature, says, thus far and no farther. Ironically, the practical effect of this is that this proof of microevolution casts grave doubt on proof of the larger question, macroevolution, which is the core issue in the struggle between evolutionists and creationists. Now, I realize a lot of this seems technical and boring, but you need to understand that this issue is really, really important. This is fundamental in the conflict between the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman. We are what we think, and we act based upon what we think. Every action of ours is always motivated by something that we first thought. If we think a thing is good, then we'll move in that direction. If we think a thing is bad, we'll move in the other direction. There is no avoiding it. Ideas are extremely consequential. And if we don't control, or at least carefully examine the ideas that we allow in our heads, we'll find ourselves doing things that run across the grain of what we claim to be in our lives, if we're believers. I think that acting as a default Christian, instead of carefully and thoughtfully thinking through what you should be doing, what you should be thinking, is an abdication of your responsibility to God. Furthermore, they overlook the fact that what occurs in selective breeding is not an enhancement of the DNA of the altered species, but a degrading of it. For example, the reason poodles reproduce faithfully without an occasional wolf puppy is that the canine DNA in the poodle has lost the capacity to produce wolves or any other breed of canine. It has only the DNA information required to produce poodles. This means that it is virtually impossible for a breeder to reverse the process and make a wolf of poodles solely using the poodle strain of canines. That is, he can't breed back to the wolf because the poodle does not have within its DNA any longer some of the necessary qualities that go into making a wolf. And unless you breed poodles to wolves, you'll never make a wolf out of a poodle. There has been a net loss of DNA, not gain, making poodles far less adaptive and thus far less fit for survival, even upon the evolutionist model. Gregor Mendel, a 19th century scientist and Augustinian friar and abbot, conducted careful, controlled genetic studies to determine to what extent life forms could change and still reproduce themselves. It is those laws which are borne out in the efforts of animal breeders. He discovered that limited changes are possible over relatively narrow ranges. However, at the extreme limits of the ranges of changes, several negative effects occur, including lower hardihood and diminished reproductivity, which works against survival of the fittest. So the mechanism that they claim accounts for natural selection actually defeats natural selection because it makes survival of the fittest less likely and it makes them less fit to survive, and thus it is a refutation of the whole idea that the fittest will survive by these kinds of changes. The extreme products of such unions are known as hybrids, which lack regenerative ability. An example of this is the union of a donkey with a horse. The offspring is a mule. A mule is a hybrid which cannot reproduce itself. Furthermore, the changes which Mendel's studies proved could occur were invariably within narrow biological limits which roughly mirrored what the Bible calls divisions by kind, not changes of one kind into another. So they haven't refuted the Bible at all. In the end, if God's word is not true, then there is no truth in the universe. But if there's no truth in the universe, then I couldn't be talking to you and telling you things that I'm claiming are true. And you couldn't be determining whether, in your mind, they're true or not true. Even if you decide that what I'm telling you is not true, you're telling me it's not true based upon a standard of truth within yourself. And if that's a standard of truth within yourself, that standard of truth that you adhere to and determining that what I say is not true denies your claim that God is not true and does not exist. Because for truth to exist, there must be a source for truth, and that source cannot be men. Look at yourself. You're a mortal creature. You will die. You're finite. You're fallible. You're errant. You make mistakes. You make mistakes often, daily. And if you're the source of infallible, inerrant truth, then you're lost. You certainly can't save yourself. You can't even find your way out of a wet paper bag. Apart from the truth that God has stamped on his creation and that he puts in each one of us, the standard of truth that's in each one of us, you could know nothing. But you do know things. And the fact that you do know things is proof that God exists. And if God exists, then he's told us about himself. And he's told us about himself in his word. And as you read his word speaks his name out clearly. Jesus says, my sheep hear my voice, and they recognize me and follow me. They know my voice and follow me. Now, unbelievers will say, well, that's special pleading. You say that you hear his voice. I don't hear his voice. Well, of course you don't. But in the same way that you don't hear his voice, and I do hear his voice, claiming I'm special pleading because I can hear his voice, but you're not special pleading because you don't hear his voice, is nonsense. In the same way that I'm making a special pleading because I can hear his voice, you are doing the same thing because you can't hear his voice. Because the proof of his existence is all around you. The fact that you have standards, the fact that you do mean things when you talk, that you do act as if there's purpose in life, all of which are unaccountable in a purely naturalistic universe, means that there is a God, and that he certainly would have spoken to us, and that we have an obligation to submit to his authority because he's our creator. So these discussions are not merely a sterile exercise in intellectualism. They are the meat and potatoes of life. They determine the issues of life. If there is no God, there's nothing. There's nothing. Nothing. But we know that nothing is not what there is. Therefore, there is a God. Let's look into the time requirement for evolution to have existed, assuming it's possible, which I don't grant, but for purposes of argument. Scientific evolutionists point to carbon or radiometric dating to prove the Earth has existed for billions of years. However, what is not commonly revealed is that the proof of either one rests on the assumption called steady state that the rate of carbon-14 or radioactive depletion occurring today has always been the same. It is an unproved assumption smuggled in as a foundation for other assumptions that are also unproved. An illustration might be helpful here. Imagine a bathtub 90% filled with water with the tap running. If I ask you how long it took to fill the bathtub up to the level where it is, you say, well, that's not a terribly difficult problem. We'll measure the tub, measure the water in the tub, measure the volume produced per unit of time at the current rate of flow from the tap, and then we can reach a conclusion about how long the water has been running and how long it will take to fill the tub. But think carefully. There are unspoken and unproven assumptions in our example. We do not know how long the water has been flowing, whether it flowed at the same rate throughout, whether there was water from another source at some point, nor whether there was water in the tub to begin with, not to mention the possible evaporation rate, or whether water had been removed from the tub or added to it by some unknown agency. We know none of those things. Now, unless we assume the answers to all of those questions, we can't possibly arrive at a true conclusion about the questions that we would have, about how long it took. In the early days of geology, James Hutton and Charles Lyell formulated the principles of uniformitarianism, or what has been called steady state theory. They ruled catastrophism out of court. That is the idea of a worldwide flood, for instance. Without regard to the evidence revealed in the facts of geology, the theory of uniformitarianism proposed as an operating assumption that processes currently at work in geological formation had substantially always worked as they do currently. Now, you see the problem with their assumption. It's quite exactly the same as our assumption about the bathtub and the water flowing into it. There are a lot of things they cannot know. So to make an assumption like that, I mean, if you want to make that assumption, you say, assuming this is correct, then these are the correct conclusions that we draw from that. Well, that would be fine. But they don't tell you they're making that assumption. They don't justify the assumption. They just give you their conclusions as if it were facts. It's not. Stephen Jay Gould, who is no friend of creationism, an atheistic paleontologist and evolutionist, commented on Lyell. It's a lengthy quote, but you need to listen to this. Charles Lyell was a lawyer by profession. What can I say about that? And his book, Principles of Geology, is one of the most brilliant briefs ever published by an advocate. Lyell relied upon true bits of cunning to establish his uniformitarian views as the only true geology. First, he set up a straw man to demolish. In fact, the catastrophists were much more empirically minded than Lyell. Catastrophists, that means people who believe in the flood. Me. The geologic record does seem to require catastrophes. Rocks are fractured and contorted. Whole faunas are wiped out. To circumvent this literal appearance, Lyell imposed his imagination upon evidence. End quote. Now, this is Stephen Jay Gould, a noted evolutionist. But for the sake of argument, even if we grant, which we do not, that steady state theory is a permissible working assumption in geology, it does not justify scientists in failing to disclose the working assumption and failing to frame conclusions drawn from the assumption as provisional but not indubitable. To their discredit, they do not do so. Rather, all conclusions based on steady state theory are treated as proved beyond question. Excuse me. However, the conclusive proof they omit to show that processes presently observable, excuse me,
I haven't heard from you. Wish I had, but I haven't. I'm in a meeting right now. I haven't read it.
have always been as they are now, does not exist.
No,
It is an
Thursday-
unproven
Thursday
and
night,
unlikely
Friday
working
night
assumption
study.
and nothing more.
Wednesday's prayer practice. Okay.
Now, they also like to point to building blocks as
Yeah.
proving the existence
Yeah,
of shared common
okay,
uh,
okay.
ancestors. Because different organisms share the building blocks of life, then it must follow, they say, that the more complex forms have evolved from the less complex. However, from a logical perspective, unless one has presupposed the non-existence of a supernatural creator, there is no necessary basis for drawing this conclusion from that fact. The fact that organisms share building blocks doesn't necessarily mean that they share common ancestors. It would make more sense to assume that they share a common creator. And because they have ruled that assumption out of court, the only remaining assumption for them is shared ancestors. But you need to know that just isn't logically necessitated at all. Now, speculation is an accepted aspect of the scientific process, but speculation and conclusions based on proofs are categorically different, not merely different in degree. An equally justified speculation, as we mentioned, which scientific naturalists refuse to entertain, is that commonly shared building blocks are evidence of a shared creator, not shared ancestors. Not only is no effort made to disprove that living organisms sharing building blocks could demonstrate their having the same creator in common, no effort is made to prove that having commonly shared building blocks proves common ancestry. It's just assumed. Rather, it is tacitly assumed that only shared ancestors can account for the shared building blocks. This is one of the strongest proofs that they think substantiates their claim to evolutionism. And it's just built on air. It's built on air. It's got nothing to it. In the name of rigorous scientific methodology, the possibility of a common shared creator is not even given consideration. Think about that. Only a blind, willful commitment to scientific naturalism can account for this, since the question of life's origin goes beyond observational science. It necessarily includes theology and metaphysics, but for scientific naturalism, the only theology and metaphysics allowed in the courtroom of their minds must be godless. Now, the truth is, there's a sense in which all reasoning is circular. We start with our premises, and then we argue to our conclusion. But what most people don't realize is that in deductive argumentation, the conclusions are always implicit in the premises. Unless you examine the premises for their truthfulness, the conclusions are no stronger than the truthfulness of the premises. If you start with the premise that there is no creator, then all your argumentation is going to lead to the fact that for you, there is no creator. But that's not proof there is no creator. That's just proof that you started with the presumption there was no creator. And surprise, surprise, having started from that presumption, you arrive at your destination and you see a sign that says, oh, no creator. Wow, what a shock. Bill, I think that we're done. Do you have any questions?
No, sir.
My brother Don is here with us. Do you have any questions, Don?
I enjoyed your presentation. I have no questions. I
Comments?
agree with what you said. I think that people who begin by believing there is no God can only arrive at the same conclusion. And it's a shame that we don't allow ourselves to face the truth and accept it. I ran from it at one time. I now accept it.
as did I, as did Bill, as do many people. But in the end, God is always merciful and gracious to those who call upon his name. And that's what we urge you to do, if you have not done so already. Have a great day. God bless you, and we'll see you tomorrow.